A child's hand tapped on the glass of a luxury restaurant, and the millionaire inside froze with his fork in midair. What he did next silenced the entire room. Ethan Vale sat alone by the window, the linen bright, the glass warm with light, the room a soft hum. The waiter set down base on risotto, steam lifting, a ribbon of herbs shining, the plate arranged a promise. Ethan lifted his fork and paused, a habit that made the bite feel earned, a rule he kept. Outside, rain drew threads on the pane. The street turned a mirror, taillights drifted, and blurred paint. He liked nights like this, controlled and quiet, the schedule in his pocket certain, the morning mapped in lines. A light tap touched the window, then another, gentle and sure, not loud, not hurried, simply a call that waited. He turned and saw a small hand pressed to the glass, pale against the rain, steady in the trembling cold. A face rose beside it, a child with dark hair stuck to her cheeks, wide eyes under a tired hood. Her breath made a fogged circle that bloomed and cleared, rhythm of a child's steadying courage. The waiter at the bar began to move, a smile ready, the kind used to smooth scenes of view. Ethan raised 2 fingers. Wait. And the waiter stopped with linen folded on his arm. The room holding, the child did not knock again. She looked, careful and silent, as if the looking itself were language. Ethan felt something turn inside his chest, an old hinge that had not moved in years, stiff and real and sudden. He saw water run along her sleeve and drip from the cuff, a thin line that vanished into the dark. His phone buzzed once against his ribs. A meeting note for morning, a lender at 9, a launch at noon. It did not move him. The words slid away, and weightless, while the rain kept time against the window. He set down the fork and folded his napkin, left of the plate straight and neat, the steam thinning to nothing. He could finish his meal and let staff do what staff are trained to do, forget the tap, remember the plan. Yet the room felt drawn toward the glass, as if every light and flower led his eye to that small hand. He raised his hand again, and the maitre d' approached, with quiet steps, voice gentle, ready to offer a polite solution. Ethan nodded toward the street door, not the kitchen door, and said it should be opened. Simple words that changed the air. The latch clicked softly. Warm air slipped outward. Rain answered with a brighter hiss, the strip of light widening on wet stone. Ethan did not lift his fork. Lemon and thyme faded. Time stretched. The plate now a painting he had no wish to touch. He watched the child through the glass, and he felt the shape of his evening bend, as plans loosened and concern grew. The hunger that stayed was not for food. It was for the question in her eyes, and the answer he owed. Ethan watched the room change around a single knock. The staff moved as they always did, quick and polite, trained to protect the dining room from anything that might disturb a guest. A hostess crossed the floor with a tray tucked at her hip, her smile practiced and bright, but when she reached the window it looked strained. 2 servers hovered near the door, waiting for a nod from someone higher to decide which small kindness to offer. It was the kind of care that treats discomfort like a stain that must be blotted away, neat and invisible, no trace left where the comfortable sit. Patrons shifted in their chairs, voices falling to softer tones, glances traded like quiet judgments. Someone coughed. Someone coughed again. The orchestra played a softer phrase, and the child kept her hand on the glass, watching, patient and brave in a way that made the room feel oddly fragile. Ethan felt his fork weightless in his fingers, hovering over a plate that had been perfectly prepared and now looked like a prop in a scene he did not want to be part of. The waiter watched him for permission to act as if nothing had happened, as if the world could be set back into its tidy order with the right angle of a nod. The maitre d' moved forward, voice low and steady, offering the menu for a child, a warm blanket, an offer to call the police. All the polite solutions the house had rehearsed for strangers who wandered in from the rain. The child's eyes did not leave him, and the silence between them stretched like the space before a decision. Ethan felt the small, impossible tug that sometimes arrives without warning, the one that asks you to choose what you will remember of yourself. He pushed his chair back a fraction, the scrape soft against the floor, and the room seemed to inhale. He could picture the headlines in his head, absurd and neat, a story about a busy CEO who paused for charity. He could imagine the quick calls, the donations logged against marketing budgets, the social media photos that thanked him for being kind. Those things mattered. In a way, his world measured. But in that moment they felt thin, like wrapping paper around a small and urgent truth. A woman at the bar whispered something, a ripple of disapproval. But no one spoke up for the child. No one reached the glass. Ethan's appetite had left him completely, the taste gone from the meal as if someone had turned off the light inside it. He set the fork down cleanly, folded his napkin with hands that were steadier than he felt, and rose. People murmured, a hush of curiosity and discomfort following him like a shadow. The hostess hesitated, eyes wide with the question everyone in the room felt, and Ethan simply opened the door. The rain breathed in, and the street smelled sharp and honest. The child's face framed by the wet glass as she stepped inside, small and certain, and for the first time that evening, the restaurant felt like a place where something true might happen now. Rain threaded the street into glass and light, and Ethan watched from the doorway as the child waited under the awning. She pressed a small hand to the window, the skin pale against the fogged glass, and a younger boy huddled behind her, the hood of his jacket pulled up like a small shield. Her clothes were thin, the fabric strained at the seams. There were patched stitches where someone had mended what they could, and the shoes showed scuffs that spoke of long walks. Ethan had seen poverty on reports and in charity letters. He had met needs with foundations and programs. But this was immediate and close, not an item to be scheduled into a plan. The maitre d' moved with a practiced ease, a smile that smoothed edges, offering blankets and taxis, the polite choreography designed to keep the dining room a place where trouble did not interrupt the comfort of paying guests. Conversations hushed into curiosity, the glow of phones brightening as people leaned to catch the small drama at the window. Ethan felt his fork in his hand like a tool he no longer needed, and the steam rising from his plate seemed to evaporate the appetite he had arrived with. He had rehearsed responses for many situations, but none had prepared him for the way a small palm pressed to glass could rewrite a night. Up close, he saw details that did not translate into charts, the sort of things an assistant might notice but rarely bothered to report. The girl had the quick, alert posture of someone who watched for danger, her movements precise, as if carved from caution. Her fingers were rough at the knuckles, the nails bitten down, the skin dry and weathered from washing small things or from the rain. The boy's cheeks were too pale, the kind of pallor that comes from interrupted sleep, and his eyes held a curious trust that made Ethan ache. There was a faint mark near the girl's wrist, a shadow of something older, the kind of bruise that had begun a long time ago and never quite healed. He crouched without thinking, a motion that closed the height between them and made it harder to be the sort of man who measures worth by balance sheets. The hum of the restaurant seemed to back away, as if the room respected the small conversation that needed to happen. He asked the girl her name, and she answered plainly, Lily, the voice small and steady. When he asked the boy, his answer came soft and quick, Jonah, as if the name itself was a comfort. They told him in short, careful sentences that their building had changed the locks and they had nowhere to go, that they had been walking for most of the day. There was no pleading, only a clear account of what had happened. A staff member hovered with a blanket tucked over an arm and a polite offer on his lips, the kind of solution that is tidy and forgettable. Ethan shook his head and asked instead if they had eaten. The kitchen prepared something hot, and while the children ate, he listened. Lily spoke of a neighbor who sometimes left bread on a step, of nights spent wrapped in old coats, of small kindnesses that had kept them moving. Jonah smiled at the story of a dog that once followed them a block and then left, A tiny miracle in a hard life. When the plates were cleared, Ethan stood and offered his arm, not as a staged charity, but as a practical way to get them somewhere safe for the night. Lily hesitated, memory tight across her face, then slid her hand into his with a fragile hope. Jonah came close, and they stepped into the rain together, the city folding around them like a map that could be changed. Ethan watched them go, and felt his evening transform, the unfinished meal left on the table, suddenly less important than the small, aching business of keeping two children safe. The maitre d' lingered by the door, his hand half raised to call security, but Ethan's quiet gesture stopped him. A simple nod was enough, the kind of signal that carried weight in a place where money and reputation ruled the air. The staff hesitated, uncertain, because this was not how things were supposed to unfold in a restaurant, where each detail had been rehearsed, from the polished silver to the exact temperature of the wine. Still, Ethan's word was law, and slowly the door opened, letting the night air slip inside with the faint smell of rain and pavement. The two children stepped across the threshold, bringing the storm with them, their shoes leaving small damp marks on the marble floor. The girl walked first, her chin raised higher than her years should have carried. The boy tucked close behind her, almost hidden in the folds of her coat. They looked out of place under the chandeliers, fragile and solemn, their clothes worn thin and heavy with water. Murmurs rippled across the tables, guests leaning toward one another, voices lowered but sharp with judgment. A man in a dark suit frowned at his plate, as if the sight of children in need might ruin the taste of his dinner. A woman in pearls covered her mouth and whispered to her companion. The orchestra faltered, the violin bow slipping for just a breath before the music steadied again. Ethan rose to his feet and pulled out the empty chair across from his own, a gesture so natural it silenced the nearest tables. He beckoned with one hand, and the girl guided her brother forward, her eyes darting between Ethan and the watchful staff. She moved with caution, the way someone steps into a room where they are not sure if they will be welcomed or turned away. The maitre d' approached again, voice polite, suggesting a private lounge might be more comfortable. But Ethan shook his head. Here was fine. Here at the table where he had been eating alone. The children sat, stiff and quiet, their hands folded in their laps as if they feared touching anything that did not belong to them. The waiter hovered uncertainly with Ethan's plate still untouched. Ethan gave a small nod toward the kitchen, and moments later a new setting was placed before the children. Clean and careful, silver polished, water poured. The boy stared at the glass as though it were treasure. The girl whispered something to him, and only then did he lift it with both hands and take a sip. Conversations began again around the room, though softer now, shaded with curiosity. Some diners stole glances, some shook their heads, others pretended not to notice at all. Ethan felt their eyes on him, the weight of their unspoken questions, but none of it mattered. What mattered were the two children across from him, the girl with watchful eyes and the boy who clung to her sleeve. Ethan picked up his fork but found no desire for his own meal. Instead, he pushed the plate gently toward them and said quietly that they should eat. The girl hesitated only a moment before lifting a piece for her brother, and the room seemed to hold its breath as they began. For Ethan, the food he had ordered no longer carried any taste, but the act of sharing it filled him with something far more important than appetite. The whispers continued, but he no longer cared, because for the first time in a long while, his table no longer felt empty. The table felt different the moment the children sat down, as though the polished wood and shining crystal were no longer part of a routine dinner, but part of something fragile and unspoken. The girl kept her back straight, her small shoulders tense, her hands folded tightly on her lap. She looked at Ethan with a mixture of caution and resolve, her brown eyes older than her 9 years should have allowed. When he asked her name, her voice came out, soft but steady. "Lily," she said. And then she touched the arm of the boy beside her and added, "This is Jonah." The boy said nothing, his wide eyes darting around the room, lingering on the chandeliers and the tall windows, then back down to the silver fork beside his plate, as if unsure whether he was allowed to touch it. Ethan leaned back slightly, giving them space, feeling the weight of every glance in the room. He was used to being watched, used to whispers in restaurants and boardrooms, but this time the attention was not for his wealth or power. It was for the two children who had stepped in from the rain and now sat across from him, dripping onto the elegant carpet. The waiter shifted nervously at the edge of the table, waiting for direction, and Ethan gave a small nod. The untouched plate that had been set before him was placed gently in front of the children. Ethan gestured toward it, his voice low and even, telling them they should eat. Lily hesitated, her fingers hovering above the fork, her eyes flicking to Jonah, then back to Ethan. It was as if she expected the offer to vanish the moment she reached for it, as if kindness was a trick that might disappear. When Ethan gave her a reassuring nod, she finally picked up the fork and cut a piece, placing it on the smaller plate in front of her brother. Jonah leaned forward, his movements quick but careful, and took a bite. His expression shifted from fear to something softer, the smallest sigh escaping him as though he had been holding his breath all evening. Lily watched him eat before taking a bite herself, still cautious, still holding herself stiffly as if the moment could break at any second. Ethan did not touch the wine by his hand or the bread waiting in the basket. He simply watched. He saw how Lily made sure Jonah's plate was never empty before she took another bite for herself. He noticed the way Jonah's shoulders loosened slowly, how the lines of worry on his young face began to ease with every mouthful. The restaurant noise dimmed around them, the clatter of plates and low conversations fading into a kind of background hum. At this table, there was only silence. The silence of people who were not used to being heard. Ethan thought of all the meals he had eaten alone in places like this, surrounded by beauty, yet untouched by it. He thought of his empire, the hotels that promised comfort to strangers, and wondered how much comfort he had ever truly given. Watching the two children eat from his plate, he realized his hunger was gone, replaced by something he could not yet name. It was not pity, nor was it obligation. It was a stirring, faint but insistent, that told him this moment mattered more than any carefully planned evening. The fork moved slowly from plate to mouth, small bites taken as though each one needed to be savored in case it was the last. Lily kept glancing at Jonah, checking that he was eating enough, making sure he drank his water before she allowed herself another taste. Ethan sat quietly, not rushing them, not asking questions at first. He had learned in boardrooms that silence could be powerful, that people often revealed more when given space. And here at this table, he saw the same truth unfolding. Lily's shoulders relaxed just enough for her voice to find its way out, hesitant at first, then steadier, like a stream beginning to cut through stone. She said their mother was gone, the words spoken flatly without detail, as if explaining more would make it hurt again. Jonah's fork paused when she said it, and he lowered his head, chewing slowly as if he wanted to swallow the ache with the food. Their father, she continued, was away. The pause around that word filled with meanings Ethan did not press her to name. Away could mean in prison, away could mean vanished, away could mean a promise broken so often it was easier to leave it undefined. What mattered was that they were here without him, the weight of that absence heavy in the space between their words. The rent had not been paid, Lily explained, her small hands wrapping around the edge of the table as though she could hold on to something steady. Locks changed, doors closed, neighbors who once smiled now avoided them. They had tried to stay with a cousin for a week, then with a family friend, but each place had its limits, and each goodbye felt colder than the last. Nights were spent in shelters where the air smelled of bleach and fear, or on the couches of people who owed their father favors but no longer wanted to be reminded of him. She spoke of it as though she were much older than 9, her voice carrying the rhythm of survival, not childhood. Jonah stayed quiet, except for the sound of his spoon against the plate. But his silence spoke in other ways. When Lily mentioned walking long distances because bus fare had been spent on bread, His shoulders tensed. When she spoke of Jonah crying in his sleep, she fell silent, then straightened her back, as if she could protect him even in the telling. Ethan listened, his chest tightening with every detail. He thought of the rain outside, the way it slid down the window like time, endless and indifferent. And he thought of these two children pressed against that same glass, waiting for someone to notice. The dining room carried on, though more quietly now. Some guests pretended not to hear. Others leaned closer with pity, thinly disguised as curiosity. Ethan ignored them all. What mattered was Lily's steady voice, Jonah's wide eyes, and the truth that had slipped into his evening like a stone dropped in still water, rippling outward until nothing felt the same. He realized that while their plates might soon be empty, the story beneath the surface had only just begun, and it was one he could not look away from any longer. The children's voices faded into the hum of the restaurant, their words settling into Ethan's chest, like stones dropped into deep water. Lily's steady telling, Jonah's silence, the way both of them carried more weight than children should ever have to carry, stirred something he had buried years ago. He watched the girl cut food carefully for her brother, her small hands moving with a patience learned not from play but from necessity, and he was taken back to a different table, long ago, one where he had sat alone with cold leftovers while voices argued behind a closed door. He remembered the nights after his parents' divorce, when his mother worked late and his father stopped calling. The house had been filled with the quiet of absence, the television left on as a companion, the refrigerator humming louder than his own breathing. He remembered sitting by his window, looking out at the streetlights, wondering if anyone could see how lonely he was. Nobody knocked, nobody asked if he was all right, and the silence became a weight he carried into adulthood. He had turned it into drive, into the relentless ambition that built his hotels and filled his accounts, but underneath it all, the boy by the window had never been comforted. The children across from him were not so different from the child he had been. Their clothes were worn, their eyes older than their years, and their hunger went beyond food. They longed for safety, for someone to notice, for someone to choose them without being asked. Ethan felt the old ache rise, the memory of waiting in vain for a father who never came, of birthdays celebrated with a cake too small and a silence too loud. The memory stung because it reminded him of how easily loneliness can shape a life, and how close he had come to letting that same loneliness harden him into someone who mistook wealth for love and schedules for belonging. He set his glass down slowly, his hands steady though his chest was tight. The restaurant noise faded in his mind, until all he heard was the echo of his younger self and the knock that had never come. Tonight, though, a knock had sounded, not at his own window, but at the glass of a restaurant, delivered by a child who refused to remain unseen. It was a reminder, sharp and undeniable, that some voices are soft yet urgent, and that they can break through even the strongest walls built around the heart. Ethan looked at Lily and Jonah and felt the line between past and present blur. He saw himself in their shadows, a boy who had once wished for someone to notice, someone to listen. No one had come then, but perhaps he could be the one to answer now. The thought was not yet a decision, not yet a plan, but it stirred inside him with the power of memory, the kind that does not fade, but waits for the moment when it can finally be redeemed. The maitre d' moved toward the table with the careful steps of someone trained to smooth out every wrinkle in a room, his hands folded in front of him, his expression pleasant but firm. He leaned slightly, prepared to whisper a suggestion about a private lounge or a side room where the children could be served without disturbing the other guests. Before the words could form, Ethan lifted his hand in a quiet motion that needed no explanation. The wave was small, almost casual, but it carried a weight that stopped the maitre d' in his tracks. There was no mistaking who held authority here, no question about who decided what was acceptable at this table. The maitre d' nodded once, tight and professional, retreating with the same grace he had approached. The staff around him froze in place for a moment, then scattered back to their duties, though none of them could quite hide the way their eyes kept returning to the unusual scene in the corner. The rules of fine dining had been bent, and it unsettled them. A man like Ethan Vale was expected to dine with investors, dignitaries, and celebrated guests, not two children in wet jackets who left damp marks on the upholstered seats. The children kept eating, unaware of the tension their presence created, or perhaps simply too hungry to care. Lily cut another piece of fish for Jonah, sliding it onto his plate before taking one for herself, her movements precise and deliberate. Jonah leaned over his water glass with both hands wrapped around it, his eyes darting nervously to the chandeliers, the polished silver, the tall men in tailored suits. He chewed slowly, as if afraid that eating too quickly might somehow end the meal sooner. Around them, whispers began to swell. A woman in diamonds leaned close to her husband, her lips barely moving as she remarked that it was inappropriate, a distraction in such a refined setting. A man 2 tables over cleared his throat loudly, as though the sound might remind everyone of where they were and what kind of company they expected to keep. Others tried to disguise their curiosity by pretending to study their menus or sip their wine, though their eyes kept drifting back to the corner where the millionaire sat with his unexpected guests. Ethan felt every glance, but none of it mattered. His posture was steady, his gaze fixed on the children, his presence enough to silence any challenge. The waiters who passed by adjusted quickly, refilling glasses and clearing plates with professional composure, though their hands shook just slightly as they placed dishes before Lily and Jonah. The orchestra at the far end of the dining room carried on with its soft strings, but even that seemed to bend around the quiet gravity of the table. When Jonah finally set down his fork with a small sigh of satisfaction, the boy's plate nearly clean, Lily followed with a more careful pace, making sure her brother had finished before she allowed herself the last bite. The silence at their table held stronger than the murmurs around them, a pocket of stillness in a room that had never known such unease. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his decision firm, and though the wealthy strangers continued to stare, none dared to speak above a whisper. The authority of a man like him was enough to turn judgment into silence, and in that silence, 2 children finished their meal in peace. The plates had been cleared and the silver polished back into place, but Ethan made no move to order coffee or dessert. The children sat quietly, their hands folded again, their bellies full in a way that seemed to both comfort and confuse them. Lily thanked the waiter in a voice so soft he nearly missed it, while Jonah clutched the edge of his chair, as if letting go might cause the evening to vanish like a dream. Ethan signed the bill without looking at the number, his signature swift and final, and stood. The entire restaurant seemed to pause as he gestured for the children to follow. They slipped from their chairs with hesitant steps, and together they crossed the dining room beneath a storm of curious eyes. Outside, the night had softened into drizzle, the kind of rain that coated the air rather than fell from it, leaving a silver sheen on every surface. Ethan held the door for them, and the warmth of the restaurant spilled out into the cool, damp street. The children stepped onto the sidewalk, blinking at the sudden shift, their figures small beneath the glowing street lamps. Lily pulled Jonah's hood over his head, tugging the frayed strings tight, while Ethan adjusted his own coat collar against the mist. For a moment they stood in silence, the hum of traffic filling the space, the sound of tires rolling through shallow puddles. At the curb, Lily and Jonah hesitated. Their posture shifted, the same stiff stance Ethan had seen when they first entered. It was the stance of children who knew what it felt like to be told they had stayed long enough, that they had taken more than they were welcome to. Lily reached for Jonah's hand, squeezing it lightly, as if preparing him for dismissal. Her eyes flicked to Ethan, waiting for the words she expected. A kind but firm send off. Maybe an offer of a cab fare or a blanket. Gestures that would make the night easier, but not change the shape of their lives. Ethan looked down at them and felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the memory of standing on a different curb long ago, his own small bag packed after another argument between his parents, waiting for a father who never came. He saw the same guarded hope in Lily's face, the same silent bracing he had once carried in his bones. He realized that if he sent them away now, they would add this night to a long list of almost kindnesses, moments when adults had paused but not stayed. The drizzle dampened his hair, ran down the back of his neck, but he stayed still watching them. Jonah leaned closer to his sister, whispering something Ethan could not hear, and Lily nodded, her chin lifting with a kind of brittle strength. Ethan understood that she was preparing to walk away, to return to whatever shelter or stairwell they had planned for the night. He felt his hand move before his thoughts caught up. He reached out, resting it lightly on Jonah's shoulder, then on Lily's. The touch made them both look up, startled, as if they had forgotten for a moment that someone might choose to keep them near. He didn't speak right away, letting the drizzle and the night hold the pause. The city moved around them, indifferent and fast, but at the edge of the curb, time felt slower. The children waited, braced for the end, but Ethan's silence carried something else. It carried the weight of a decision, the kind that reshapes a night, perhaps even a life. The drizzle painted faint halos around the streetlights, softening the edges of the city while the night held the three of them in a quiet pause. Ethan stood with the children at the curb, his coat damp at the shoulders, their small figures pressed close together as though the sidewalk itself might push them back into the shadows if they let go of each other. Lily tilted her face up to him, her brown eyes steady and unafraid despite the way her fingers clutched Jonah's sleeve. She asked a question so simple, it landed heavier than any business deal he had ever negotiated. She wanted to know if he would return inside and finish his meal now that they had eaten. Ethan blinked at her, the words catching him off guard, not because of their shape, but because of the truth tucked inside them. She had expected him to let them in, to feed them, and then to return to his table, his wine glass, his untouched plate, and his world that had no place for them once their hunger was satisfied. He looked back through the restaurant window, where his plate still waited, the fish cooling, the risotto clinging together as the steam faded. The scene looked staged, as if frozen for a photograph in a magazine, elegant but lifeless. For the first time he saw it not as luxury but as distance, a barrier he had built around himself with money and habits, polished silver and careful planning. He thought of how many nights he had eaten alone at tables like that, surrounded by people yet untouched by them, convincing himself that efficiency was enough, that control was comfort. He had mistaken order for meaning, believing that if he arranged his life like the plates before him, every detail neat, every corner clean, then loneliness could not slip through the cracks. Yet here were two children with rain in their hair and patched sleeves at their wrists, and they had undone all of it with a knock on the glass. Ethan lowered his eyes to Lily and Jonah, their faces tilted toward him with quiet expectation. The question still hung between them, light in sound, but heavy in weight. He realized he no longer wanted the meal that had been prepared with such precision, no longer hungered for the predictable rhythm of fine dining that had filled his evenings. What stirred inside him now was not appetite but awareness, a sense that life could not be plated so carefully, that its true taste came in moments unscripted and imperfect, when you chose to step beyond the routine and listen to a knock that others tried to ignore. He shook his head gently, a smile flickering at the edge of his mouth, and told Lily that the meal waiting inside was not what he wanted anymore. The children exchanged a glance, a mixture of surprise and something warmer, something like trust. The drizzle continued, but Ethan no longer noticed the chill. The question had lingered, and the answer had come, not in words alone, but in the shift he felt within himself, the quiet certainty that the life he had arranged so carefully was no longer enough. The car pulled up, with its lights cutting across the wet pavement, the driver stepping out quickly to open the door as if nothing unusual was happening. He was used to routine, used to seeing his employer leave fine restaurants and slip into the back seat without a word. Tonight he hesitated for the briefest moment when he saw the two children standing beside Ethan, their clothes damp and clinging, their shoes marked with mud. Ethan gave a small nod, and the driver adjusted his expression back into the neutral calm he always carried. The door opened, and Ethan gestured for Lily and Jonah to climb in first. They slid across the leather seat carefully, as though afraid to stain it, their small bodies tense with the effort of taking up as little space as possible. Lily guided Jonah toward the far side, tucking him close by the window, her hand resting on his arm to steady him. Ethan followed them in, the door closing with a heavy thud that sealed them in a world apart from the drizzle outside. The engine hummed, smooth and quiet, the city lights streaking across the windows as the car began to move. Ethan asked where home was, his voice low but certain, expecting at least an address, a street, some place he could direct the driver. Lily's eyes dropped to her lap, her fingers twisting together before she lifted her shoulders in a small shrug. Jonah leaned against her, his head resting on her sleeve, and said nothing. The silence that followed was sharp, carrying more weight than words could. Home was not a place they could point to. Home had slipped away, when the locks had been changed, when the doors had closed, when the adults they trusted had vanished one by one. Ethan sat back, the reality of their answer pressing against him harder than any boardroom argument or investor demand ever had. He gave the driver a brief instruction to keep driving. No destination, just the slow roll of tires through the city streets. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, surprised but too disciplined to ask questions, and turned down a quiet avenue lined with trees that dripped silver in the lamplight. The car was silent, except for the soft hiss of the tires against wet asphalt and the occasional sigh from Jonah as sleep began to pull at him. Lily stayed awake, her eyes on the passing lights, her expression caught between defiance and exhaustion. Ethan wanted to ask more, to press for details, but something held him back. He knew when silence was the only truth people could give, and this was one of those times. He let the quiet stretch, let it hold the three of them together, and in that quiet, he felt the shape of something forming, not yet a decision, not yet a plan, but a responsibility he could not shrug off. The city blurred outside the window, its rhythm steady and indifferent, but inside the car, the silence spoke of lives interrupted, and the possibility, faint but real, that the ride itself might be the beginning of something new. The ride stretched longer than Ethan expected, the silence broken only by the rhythm of the rain against the glass and the soft hum of the tires. When he asked again if there was anywhere they wanted to go, Lily whispered an address so faint the driver had to glance back to be sure he had heard it. She spoke it with reluctance, as though the words themselves were heavy, and Jonah leaned further into her arm, his small body curling tighter, as if bracing for what was ahead. The driver nodded once, and steered them toward a neighborhood Ethan rarely passed through anymore, a place where the streets narrowed and the glow of the city dimmed into tired corners. The car slowed before a crumbling building, with bricks stained from years of weather and neglect. The steps leading up were chipped, the railing bent, and half the windows were either cracked or covered with plastic. Lily's chin lifted with a kind of quiet pride as she told Jonah they were home, though the words sounded thin in the damp air. Ethan stepped out with them, his shoes sinking slightly into the cracked pavement, and followed as Lily fished a key from her pocket. The door resisted before it gave way, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the air was cool and stale, carrying the faint smell of damp plaster and dust. The hallway was narrow, lined with peeling paint, and the lights above flickered. Lily led them to a small unit on the third floor, her hand tight on Jonah's as they climbed the stairs. When she opened the door, Ethan felt a weight settle in his chest. The apartment was almost empty, more echo than space. A single mattress lay in the corner, a thin blanket crumpled on top, and a small pile of clothes folded neatly beside it. There were no chairs, no table, no signs of comfort beyond what the children had managed to keep in order. On the floor by the window sat a stack of unopened envelopes, their edges curling with damp. Ethan glanced at the print on the top one and recognized utility companies, past due notices, and a final warning stamped in red. A faint draft slipped through the broken seal of the window, rattling the glass and brushing against the thin blanket on the mattress. Jonah walked to it and sat down heavily, as though the sight of something familiar was enough to let him rest. Lily knelt beside him, smoothing the blanket with hands that tried to make it look more than it was. Ethan stood in the doorway, his coat still damp, the contrast between his world and theirs pressing into him with sharp clarity. He had walked through countless hotel suites with polished floors and endless amenities, but here he saw survival shaped out of almost nothing. The children did not complain, did not explain, they simply moved, as though this space, bare and cold, was theirs to guard. Ethan realized in that moment that stepping back into his own life and leaving them here was something he could not do. Not now, not ever. Ethan's eyes stayed on the pile of envelopes by the window, their corners bent, their paper worn from being shifted again and again without ever being opened. Something about the stack unsettled him more than the bare mattress or the cold walls. He stepped closer, the children watching him with quiet unease, and picked one up. The paper was thin, the seal cheap, but the red letters stamped across the front carried weight. Final notice, payment overdue, account subject to closure. He lifted another and another, the names of the companies familiar. Then his chest tightened when he saw the letterhead of the bank. The logo was sharp, bold, impossible to miss. It was his bank. He froze, the envelope heavy in his hand. The company that bore his name, the empire he had built to symbolize success and stability, had sent these warnings. He owned the bank that had marked these children's lives with fear and final notices. His wealth had been built on efficiency, on systems designed to track every number, every risk, every late payment. Yet the reality of those systems now sat in his hand, not as numbers in a quarterly report, but as a threat that had pressed against the lives of two children who had no chance of meeting the deadlines or the demands. Lily shifted closer to Jonah, her hand resting on his back as though she thought Ethan might scold them for the pile, as though the unopened bills were proof of failure rather than the result of a world stacked against them. Ethan looked at her and felt a sharp ache run through him. She was 9 years old, and yet she already understood what it meant to carry shame that was not hers to carry. He set the envelope down carefully, almost reverently, as if it were not paper but a mirror showing him a truth he had long ignored. In boardrooms, he had spoken of growth, of market share, of lending strategies that balanced risk and reward. He had spoken of numbers as though they were separate from the lives they represented. Sitting in this empty apartment, surrounded by the proof of what those numbers did, he realized his empire was not untouched by suffering, it had created some of it. His success had not only lifted him, it had pressed down on others who could not bear the weight. The unfinished ledger lay not in his office but here, in this room, where children slept on the floor, while his hotels offered silk sheets to strangers who could afford them. He felt the imbalance, like a crack running through the ground beneath him. Jonah picked at the edge of the blanket, his small fingers tugging threads loose. And Ethan wondered how many nights the boy had fallen asleep with the sound of his sister whispering promises she could not keep, promises that things would get better. Ethan turned back to the stack of envelopes, and for the first time in years, he felt ashamed of the name printed at the top. The ledger of his empire was incomplete, and the missing balance sat before him in the form of two children who had knocked on a window, hoping someone would see. The city stretched out beneath the wide windows of Ethan's penthouse, its lights blinking like signals he could not quite read. The car had dropped him at the entrance hours ago, the children left in the care of a trusted aide with instructions that surprised even him in their urgency. Now he sat alone at his polished dining table, staring at the white boxes the restaurant had packed for him, their corners damp with condensation, their labels written in the neat hand of a server who had not dared to ask questions. He lifted the lid of one container, and the steam rose faintly, carrying the scent of lemon and thyme, the same dish he had ordered at the beginning of the evening. The food was untouched, perfect still, but his stomach turned at the sight of it. He pushed the box away, the silverware clattering softly against the table, and leaned back in his chair. Hunger should have come by now, but the only thing filling him was the memory of a small hand against glass. He could hear it still, the faint knock that had cut through the music, through the murmur of wealthy voices, through the rhythm of his planned evening. The sound replayed in his mind with the persistence of a heartbeat, steady and insistent, as if reminding him that his life had shifted in that moment and would not return to what it had been before. He rose from the table and walked to the window, his reflection faint in the glass, the city beyond blurring as the drizzle continued to fall. He thought of Lily's voice when she shrugged at his question about home, of Jonah's wide eyes as he clutched his sister's arm. He thought of the apartment with its bare mattress and its stack of unopened bills, each envelope marked with his own bank's logo. The sight of it returned again and again, sharper than any quarterly report, heavier than any contract he had signed. Sleep would not come. He lay in his bed, the sheets smooth and cool, the pillows arranged in perfect order, but his body stayed restless, his thoughts circling back to the children. He remembered being young himself, listening to the silence of a house that no longer felt like home, waiting for someone to notice his loneliness. No one had knocked then, no one had asked, and the boy he had been had grown into a man who built walls instead of bridges. Tonight those walls felt thinner, fragile against the memory of rain and small fingers tapping on glass. He rose again before dawn, pacing the darkened rooms of his penthouse. The city's glow seeped through the windows, but it offered no comfort. He passed the boxes of food, still sitting on the table, their contents cooling into waste, and he knew he could not eat them. He could not eat at all, not when he had seen what hunger looked like in two small faces pressed against the night. The knock echoed on, refusing to let him forget, refusing to let him rest, reminding him that comfort without purpose was nothing more than emptiness dressed in fine clothes. Morning light spread across the skyline in sharp lines of gold, but Ethan felt none of its warmth. He had not slept, and the weight of the night pressed against his shoulders as he stepped into the boardroom. The long table gleamed under soft lamps, polished until it shone like water, and around it sat the people who had followed him for years. They were men and women in tailored suits, their pens lined neatly beside their tablets, their eyes sharpened by habit and ambition. They expected the same rhythm as always: a review of profits, a discussion of expansion, a plan to grow the empire larger still. Instead, Ethan set his hands on the table and told them something that left the air heavy and still. He spoke of redirecting funds into community housing, into child support programs, into rebuilding the places where families slipped through the cracks. He explained how money could be shifted, how profits from one quarter could be used to ease the lives of those who had nothing, how their empire could stand not only as a monument to wealth, but as a shelter for those who had been left behind. For a moment, silence followed, and then the resistance came. One executive cleared his throat and said carefully that margins would tighten. Another reminded him of shareholders who demanded returns, not charity. A third leaned back in her chair, her voice sharp, and asked what the press would think if they saw sudden drops in revenue after years of steady growth. They spoke in turns, their words circling the same point: that profits must not fall, that investors would not tolerate softness, that the strength of the company came from numbers alone. Ethan listened, his jaw tight, his memory replaying the sound of a knock on glass. He thought of Lily shrugging when asked where home was, of Jonah curling against his sister on a single mattress in a room with unopened bills. He let his executives finish their arguments, their polished voices weaving a net of logic, and then he spoke again, slower this time. He told them that numbers without people meant nothing, that success which ignored suffering was hollow, that their empire was strong enough to bear the cost of compassion. The debate grew louder. Some leaned forward, urging him to reconsider, reminding him of contracts, of growth charts, of rankings in global markets. Others stayed quiet, eyes shifting, uncertain if his words were madness or vision. Ethan did not raise his voice, but every word carried weight. He told them he had built this company from the ground up, and he would not allow it to stand as a wall against the very people who needed its help. The room fell quiet again, the kind of silence that follows when power makes itself clear. Ethan looked at each of them in turn, and knew the resistance was not gone, but it no longer mattered. Profits might fall, margins might tighten, but he had seen what was missing from their ledgers. He would not forget it, and he would not allow them to ignore it. The boardroom still carried the smell of fresh coffee and the faint spice of breakfast pastries, the catering tray placed neatly at the center, with fruit cut into perfect cubes and small pastries stacked like ornaments. Ethan had not touched it. He pushed it away with a steady hand, the silver tray sliding across the polished wood, and the sound echoed more loudly than he expected in the tense room. The executives watched him, waiting for charts and projections, but instead he leaned forward and spoke words that none of them had prepared to hear. He told them about the children. He told them about the knock on the restaurant window, about the girl no older than 9, with rain in her hair, and her brother clinging to her side. He described how they had entered a room full of wealth and silence, how they had eaten from his plate while strangers stared, how afterward they had guided him to an apartment with a single mattress and a stack of bills marked by the very bank they owned. He spoke without notes, without slides, his voice firm but stripped of polish, as if every word had been waiting inside him for years and only now found release. The room shifted uneasily. Some executives lowered their eyes, uncomfortable, while others tried to keep their expressions neutral. Ethan continued, telling them he had not been able to finish his meal because the sight of children hungry outside their windows had taken the taste from his mouth. He said that the company's numbers meant nothing if they existed beside empty apartments and unopened bills. He said the knock had not come from strangers but from the truth, and once heard, it could not be ignored. One executive cleared his throat and muttered that personal charity was admirable but not a matter for corporate policy. Another reminded him that their shareholders expected returns, not stories. Ethan looked at them, his eyes hard, and replied that shareholders sat in warm homes because others had been left cold. He told them that the company was built on service, on hospitality, on the promise of comfort, and that promise was broken if it did not reach beyond polished lobbies and expensive suites. The silence after his words was heavier than any chart he had ever presented. He could see the resistance in their posture, the way some tapped pens against paper, the way others stared at their tablets as if hoping for an email to distract them. But he could also see something else, a shift, however small, in the way a few leaned back and exhaled, as if the truth had struck something they did not want to admit. Ethan pressed his palms flat on the table and told them he would no longer measure success only by profits. He would measure it by the knocks that came at their windows, by the lives that went unnoticed while they counted margins. He ended with one sentence, quiet but unshakable, that he would never again sit at a table filled with food and call it success while children went hungry outside their doors. The words lingered like the knock itself, a sound that could not be forgotten. Weeks later, the city looked different, though the skyline of towers and lights was the same. What had shifted was quieter, but it was real, like the way a seed breaks the ground in silence yet changes the soil forever. Ethan stood in the lobby of one of his hotels, not for a meeting with investors or a ribbon cutting for another luxury edition, but to watch the first families walk in under a new banner. The polished marble floor reflected tired shoes and small hands clutching larger ones. The air carried the scent of warm food drifting from the dining room, where free meals were being served to anyone who needed them, no questions asked. The change had started as an idea scribbled on a pad after a sleepless night, but now it lived in walls and halls and open doors. Empty apartments owned by his company had been refurbished, stripped of dust and neglect, painted bright with clean bedding placed in every room. Families who had been sleeping in shelters now had keys in their hands. The shelters themselves had expanded, with funds redirected from marketing budgets. Their kitchens enlarged, their beds multiplied. What had been numbers in a ledger was now space where children could rest without fear of being moved on in the middle of the night. The hotels, once a symbol of exclusivity, now offered something more lasting. In the evenings, dining rooms that had once closed their doors to anyone without a reservation opened them wide. Chefs in tall hats served bowls of soup, fresh bread, plates of vegetables, meals prepared with the same care given to paying guests. Ethan had insisted there be no difference, no separate lines, no second-class portions. The rule was simple. If you walked through the door hungry, you would eat with dignity. The boardroom had fought him, as he knew they would, their charts heavy with warnings about lost profit. But slowly, as news spread, as headlines praised the effort, as customers spoke with admiration instead of complaint, the resistance softened. Investors discovered that compassion did not empty the accounts as they feared. It brought loyalty, trust, and a reputation stronger than polished advertisements could ever buy. Ethan visited each site in person, walking through the shelters, shaking hands with staff, crouching down to speak to children who reminded him of Lily and Jonah. He watched their eyes widen at clean beds and stocked pantries. He listened to parents breathe sighs of relief they had been holding for years. Everywhere he went, he felt the echo of that first knock, steady and insistent, reminding him why it had begun. The knock had become more than a memory. It was a movement now, whispered in community meetings, spoken in churches, repeated in schools where children told each other about a hotel that fed families for free. Ethan felt it in every thank you, in every cautious smile, in every life eased by a choice to listen when others turned away. What had started as a sound on a rainy night had grown into something larger, something that promised to last. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt not just successful, but whole. The rain had lifted weeks ago, the skies now clear and sharp with evening stars, but Ethan still felt the echo of that first knock whenever he passed the restaurant. Tonight he walked back through its tall glass doors, no longer alone, no longer hiding the shift that had taken root inside him. Lily walked at his side, her small hand curled firmly into his. Jonah just a step behind, his eyes wide at the chandeliers and the polished silver that had once made him shrink into shadows. They no longer came as strangers at the edge of glass, but as guests invited without hesitation, their names spoken proudly when Ethan gave them to the maitre d'. The staff straightened in surprise, some remembering that rainy night, some whispering that the scene had been the start of something no one had expected. Ethan's reputation had grown beyond his empire in recent weeks. The programs he had launched, written about in papers and praised in communities. But here, he wanted none of the noise, none of the cameras. He wanted only to sit at the same table where his life had bent in a new direction and share a meal with the two children who had made it happen. The maitre d' led them to the very same spot by the tall window, the same glass where a small hand had once tapped until someone listened. Jonah pressed his palm lightly against it, testing the cool surface, smiling shyly, as if remembering what it felt like to stand on the other side. Lily held her head high, her shoulders less burdened now, her voice steady when she asked politely for water with lemon. They sat not as children waiting for scraps, but as guests, their chairs pulled out for them, their napkins placed neatly across their laps. When the plates arrived, rich with color and care, Ethan did not begin first. He pushed the platters toward Lily and Jonah, just as he had before. But this time, not out of pity or guilt. He shared because it felt right, because meals meant more when eaten together, because the sight of their faces brightening over bread and soup filled him more than the finest dish ever could. Lily laughed when Jonah reached too quickly for dessert, and the sound carried through the dining room, light and genuine, breaking through the hush that had once filled the space with judgment. Other diners turned to look, but the whispers had changed. No one frowned. No one demanded the children be removed. They saw Ethan Vale, the millionaire whose choices had altered the course of the city's compassion, and they understood that this table was not charity. It was family. It was belonging. It was proof that wealth could be measured not in what was kept, but in what was shared. Ethan leaned back as the meal went on, tasting little of his own food because his eyes were fixed on theirs. And once again he did not finish his plate. But this time it was not hunger that stopped him. It was fullness, the kind that does not come from what is eaten, but from what is given. The window behind them glowed with the city's light, no longer a barrier but a backdrop, and Ethan knew the knock that had once changed everything would live inside him forever. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.